Closed captioning is brought to you in part by Raven Reads. Unbox Indigenous voices. Subscribe today at ravenreads.org.
Welcome to Community Close-Up. I'm your host, Sharen Skelly, and today's guest is Nancy Lee. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Nancy is a researcher, genealogist, and keeper of the Negro Creek archives. Is that what I would say?
I wouldn't call it archives as much as we're researching the families that lived in the immediate vicinity of Negro Creek.
And there's a lovely website. If you go on there, it's just filled with information, and it looks like if you've ever been on Ancestry, it's like you get information like that. You can go on and you see marriage certificates and all those sorts of old documents, and you can follow the family histories, and it's all of the 1851. It starts with the 1851 ancestors, right?
We've based it on that because that was the first census for that area. There was an 1841 census, but it's intermittent. Not all the data has survived. So we started at the 1851. But most of the information, if you know, as you've seen in there, takes you back to about 1841, 1842. So I put on the different documents to prove our sources, so people could see what those documents look like, how I found the information while researching, and we just thought it'd be interesting for people going to the website. It helps you kind of walk down their road and makes it a little bit more real when you see their names in writing. And you know,
it is beautiful actually to see the handwritten documents and the dates, and you know, you can imagine them having it written out with a quill pen or whatever. It's beautiful. Now, these are people that settled in Sullivan Township, right? And Holland?
Yeah, on the east side and the west side of the Garifraxa Road, which is now Highway 6. Most of the farms are still there and working. My ancestral grandfather's farm is still there. He's right on the west side of Highway 6, right where Moto Park Road intersects, and Negro Creek runs right there, and that's where his farm was situated.
Now, there's on this website, you have all of these documents, and the family trees really is what it is. And then there's a map, an interactive map, but then there's a little bit of news and things like that on this website. And in the news, it's really kind of infuriating, some of the stuff you read, because Negro Creek, the I don't want to say street, the road name, has been so controversial, and there's so much vandalism happens to that sign. I mean, it's stolen, it's vandalized, it's what's the reason for that?
We've had lots of discussions.
Yeah.
We, you know, with our little group that's gotten together, thanks to Ben Haywood McLeod, put us kind of together, and we've all got a theory. I think a lot of it, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Such an unusual name. People think that it's derogatory, which it's not. And I think sometimes it's young kids ripping it down. Sometimes I think it's people who are racially motivated ripping it down. But we were just determined that it needs to stay.
Staying there.
The name's there because of the historical fact that there was a lot of early black settlers in this immediate area. And I guess back in the day, some of the white folks named it that because of the creek running through Henry Miller's farm, and there was at least 5 or 6 black families that were right there, either beside Henry and directly across the road from Henry. So I guess it became, you know, an area for, in the day, for Negroes who had their farms there. And it's important, I think, that that name stays. I wish they hadn't changed Motor Park Road, which takes you out into Motor Park. I wish that had stayed, because it was really both sides of this road. But however.
And there had been discussion at one point they wanted it changed.
Yes, back in the 90s.
Yes, I remember there was a big discussion. They wanted it changed.
Well, they were going to change it, and they were going to call it after Joseph Mogi, who was a white settler who lived along that concession. And then thanks to Caroline and Sylvia Wilson, who gathered their forces, and these two ladies are just magnificent to this day. I'm so privileged to have gotten to know them over the last couple of years, year and a half or so. But boy, did they really do a job. And they rallied people, and they marched, and they got a hold of the politicians. And if you read the some of the newspaper articles that Ben's put on the site, it really walks you through the struggle and what they did to ensure that name was going to stay. So I think all of us have to do a little bow down to Carolyn and Sylvia Wilson.
And that's why when you, all this website, that's important news on that website.
Yeah,
I love that story.
Yeah.
I remember that, and it was, I thought, no, leave that alone.
Yeah.
It may be offensive to some people, but it isn't offensive to them, and they want it to stay, and leave it alone.
Yeah, yeah.
Leave
they
it
did
alone.
a fantastic job.
Yeah.
And actually, the last time I spoke with them was just about a month or so ago, and I reminded them about how important their work was, and still is.
Yes.
They still do fantastic work.
Did they have the? Are they the ladies that have the museum?
The Sheffield Black Museum, and that is a fabulous
and near
place.
Collingwood.
It's in Clarksburg,
yes, near Clarksburg.
And
a shout out to that museum.
Absolutely a shout out. My husband and I were there in June just for ourselves. We were out for a nice country drive and went up, and I was shamefully, it was the first time I personally had been there, and I couldn't believe that I hadn't been there.
Yes.
And before the summer was over, actually it was the last week before school went back, and we took 2 of our 8 grandchildren out there, and we weren't sure how they were going to react. There's a lot to see, and you wander around, you go into the different cabins, and it kind of walks you through, and our grandchildren were just mesmerized. We were there for over 2 hours with a 7 and a 5-year-old. And it was, what about this, and what about that, and this and that, and it was just, and they were really excited that there was a picture of their 4th and 5th great-grandfather in the museum in Thomas Henry Miller, and that they could actually pinpoint, we belong to him, and so we're part of this.
Yes.
And that was really important.
Well, it is.
It's important for all kids to know where you come from.
That's right.
Yeah.
It is important to know.
It's important for all of us to know where we come from.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's why these archives are so interesting.
Yeah.
And even like they're important to know where you come from, but it's also important for, even if it's not our family history, just to know the history of the people that were here.
I just
like for all of us to learn and respect, and to be able to understand the history of our area.
There's a quote that I have in my home office, and it says, "As long as one person remembers you, it ain't over." And that's probably why
I love that.
And actually, it's from Oscar Hammerstein musical. And
Wow.
I read it years ago, and
love
I
that.
printed it
As
out
long
and
as
put it
one
in a
person
frame and hung it in
remembers
my
that.
home office.
I love that.
And it reminds anyone who comes into our home why I do what I do, why I started doing what I do 30 years ago and researching my own family roots. And it's why I think it's so important that these men and women are always remembered.
Oh, definitely.
There's 11 families, but it's actually, there's 11 people who we focused on. But there are actually 10 families, because there's Henry Miller and then his son Thomas Henry Miller, who had his farm directly across the street. So the only thing I would ask, if I can say their names out loud so
well, I
everybody
was going to
remembers
ask you, who are these people, and did they come? Where did they come from? How did they end up there?
So all of them were former enslaved people.
Okay.
So I'm going to go down the list.
Okay.
I do it in alphabetical order
All
usually,
right.
so
This is
remember them.
fascinating.
So there was Lewis and Caroline Armstrong, and we have found Caroline under Catherine, so we're not really sure if it was just an error in the historical documents that I found. Fielder and Ann Bowie. And Fielder was a former enslaved person. Most of them came out of Maryland and Virginia and Kentucky. Isaiah and Catherine Miller, Isaiah Chucky and Catherine Miller. And Catherine was the daughter of Henry Miller from Sullivan Township. Isaiah was an African, and we knew he was captured on the west coast of Africa and put on a slave ship and taken to the States. And for some reason, they didn't offboard him and sell him at auction. They kept him and kept on the slave ship, and he worked on it for 12 to 14 years. And then he found a chance when that ship was docked in New York City and jumped ship, made his way to Toronto somehow, and then met up with W.C. Boyd, who owned the schooner, the Fly, and he worked with W.C. Boyd on the schooner. There's some great stories in Paul White's book, Port City of Owen Sound, about Isaiah. I believe, and there's a little bit of an argument, I think, about amongst historians that, but I believe, as did Paul White, I think Isaiah was probably the first man of color in Owen Sound. Because we have him documented right around 1840-41 when the schooner was making supply drops.
That's not that long. When you think about it, 1841 is not that long
no,
ago,
180 years.
Like really?
You can almost touch it. You can almost touch it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's James and Ellen Douglas, and they went on to have a monster size of a family.
Now, were they enslaved people?
He was enslaved. We have him documented with his naturalization papers, so we knew they were in the Toronto, Greater Toronto area of Ontario around 36, 37, before the rebellion in Toronto. William and Maria Barnes Gordon. Maria was married to an Englishman named William Barnes, and he starved to death in around 42, 43. There's a write-up, small little blurb about him in the Grey County
He starved
Directory.
to death?
Well, it was a bad winter, and they, needed to. He fed his kids before he fed himself, and so there is a notation about that story. She met William Gordon, was a former enslaved person who was a friend of Henry Miller and William Gordon, and they were all from Maryland originally. I've got most of them documented in Toronto in that 37, 38 year. And the migration coming up from Toronto was really quite fascinating when you do some research on that, of the former slaves.
To hear that.
They wanted to get up here as far as they could go to get away from the slave hunters, the bounty hunters.
Stupid question. How did they get here?
Well, probably most of them walked, and some had horses and what have you. The Garifraxa was nothing much more than a mud track trail in those days, because that was part of the criteria when they got their little lots. And then there was Elias Earls, and he married Louisa Douglas, who was the daughter of James and Ellen Douglas. So right away we have a connection with two families there. And then there's my fourth great grandparents, Henry and Priscilla Miller. And they were on the west side of the Garifraxa. And then Henry and Priscilla's oldest son, Thomas Henry, he was on the east side, almost in tandem, directly across from his father's farm. And then Gazaway and Melinda, and we found a Melinda with an I, Melinda, Melody, I'm going with Melinda because that's where I saw it the most. And we know her maiden name was Thomas because we found marriage documentation. So Gazaway Ross and Scott and Rachel White. And Rachel, her maiden name was Miller, and she was the youngest daughter of Henry and Priscilla. So there's Henry and Priscilla with their daughter Catherine, who marries Isaiah Chucky, and then their other daughter who marries Scott White. Scott was also a former enslaved. And then William and Jane Woods. So they all came up in different times. I think Elias was probably one of the last ones who came up from the States.
Now, how did they get the property?
Well, this was a newly surveyed area in Sullivan Township, and it was one of the last of Ontario to be surveyed. So the word went out after Rankin surveyed. They did a survey in 36, right after the treaty, the 45.5 treaty, and then they started surveying, and they weren't really happy with how that was settled, so then they went back and resurveyed. And then what would happen, the word would go out, and most of these men and women were in the Toronto area, so you would go to the land agency, and as long as you met the criteria. One of them was you had to be a British subject. So hence we found most of their naturalization papers. And you had to be living in Canada for at least 7 years to qualify for to be a British subject. So they would have had to go get people to vouch for them and sign affidavits that yes, we'd been here, and to prove that they'd lived in Canada for that length of time. And then they had to agree to clear and cultivate a certain amount of land within the plot that they got. Most of them got 50 acres. You do see some who were able to get 100, but they were mostly British migrants.
Okay.
But these guys were getting their 50, and they had a 50 on reserve that they could get if they met the criteria and had the money to buy. That was supposed to be the deal. So in part of it, they had to help build the Garifraxa Road. So everybody on both sides, so you had to clear and cultivate and build that road. And there was 5 to 7 years, and it was an impossible task. So you see lots of petitions from white, black, all up and down that road, petitioning the Governor General from 1843 and on, saying we need more time. We can't do this.
Right.
And so you see all their names or their exes, and with their names written around. Yeah, for those who couldn't.
And did they get more time?
Yeah, they were given, like everyone on both sides.
Yeah.
Were given more time because you could say no, but the road wasn't going to be built, so there was given more time, but not a lot. They were given a few more years, and not a lot. So you see, as the years go on, some leaving. It must have been a terribly hard life.
Yeah, because they got there was nothing.
There was some land was cleared because of the indigenous were already farming and planting and cultivating the land. I mean, it's we know what it's like up here, all through central and northern Ontario. I mean, boulders, rocks, and you see those rock fences, and it's just, I stop and I'm in awe how they did this without mechanical trucks and things. So this was a tough life, and as I research them, I often stop and think, like, wow.
And then they had children.
So
were there more farms after this?
Well, more folks were coming up, white and black. These were the very earliest black settlers that we have found. And because even though they're on that 1851 census, when we go back, we can identify them in 41, 42, and 43. So we decided to let's just focus on those first ones, the ones that we know for sure were there, 41, 42, and maybe 43. And then, because it's going to be forever,
Right.
Tracing all the different families as they came up that Garifraxa, or as they came up the Toronto-Sydenham Road, which is Highway 10 now.
Right.
And so then it comes up and meets and brings you
And
on
now,
into
were there
Owen
more
Sound.
settlers there too?
That was one of the last to be surveyed. So we focused on this because of Negro Creek and those black families that sat right in Negro Creek.
But were there black families on the Highway 10?
Oh, sure.
Were there?
Sure. As you start to research and you move along, not at this time.
No.
Like this because it wasn't surveyed until much later, and then they started filling it up. By 51, 53, if you look at some of the old maps, then you really see it fill up. But not as many blacks over there as you'll see going up the Garifraxa. Gazray Ross was one of the few. He was a little further over, and I kind of focused on him. I loved his name. And I thought maybe he had a story to tell. And then as I did research and I recognized his name from doing research on Henry and Priscilla's life from my own personal family tree. And I found out that he had signed affidavits. He could write for benefit of Henry when Henry tried to get to buy Thomas Henry's lot that Thomas had basically left, and Henry continued to cultivate it and offered a fair price, and they still wouldn't give him the patent for the land that was on that his son had originally received the location ticket for. There was white farmers up and down the road who signed affidavits on his behalf. Gazaway was one of them. Even William Jackson, who was the land commissioner for the area, he signed an affidavit stating that he felt that Henry should have that piece that was across from his land on the Holland Township side. And they ended up giving the patent to an English migrant. And it wasn't unusual. James Douglas, if you read on the website about James, 30 years of fighting for his 100 acres, 30 years, and everybody got on board and tried to help him. And they were still denying him those acreage. And then it was Robert Gillies, who at first I thought he was a bad guy in this story, and then I started thinking that he wasn't a bad guy, because he also signed an affidavit on James Douglas's behalf to say he had been there for 30 years working this land, raising his family. There was nobody else but him. And in the long run, James sold his interest to Robert Gillies for $100. And then he sent a letter into the Governor General saying this was his land and he wanted the patent for it. This was in March, and in May, Robert Gillies was given that patent. And then Robert Gillies sold it back to the Douglas family. So at first I thought, well, what was going on here? And then I kind of had to look at the big picture, as you have to when you're researching.
Yeah.
And I started to think, I felt very strongly that James not receiving that patent was racially motivated. Doesn't have to be in writing that he's not getting it because he's a black man, but when a man has worked this land for 30 years and had 60 acres cultivating, and it was a working commercial farm, and Robert Gillies, who was a wealthy merchant in the area and landowner, and 2 months later he had the patent. Sometimes you just, as Carolyn Wilson always told me, sometimes you just know what you know.
Yeah, read between the lines.
Yeah, but he sold it back to the family, and to this day, a piece of that land stays in the Douglas name. Yeah, so it was a happy ending in the long run.
In the long run.
In the long run for that family.
In the long run.
Yeah.
Have any of these any of these original people gone on to, did they ever go on to great things like politicians or?
Well, I think they did do great
Well, I
things.
mean,
I know what you
when
mean.
you said the one was able to, what was that word? Authorize, what was the word?
Oh, affidavit?
Yeah, affidavit, yeah.
Well, Gazaray could read
Yeah.
and write. He could sign his own
Yeah.
name. He moved out of the area, and they went north to the Algoma region, where he settled. And him and Melinda raised a very large family and stayed up there. Anyone who has done any research on Black history in this area knows of my third great-grandfather, Thomas Henry Miller, who was a lay preacher. Lay preacher and the co-founder of the Emancipation Picnic celebration. So I don't think he thought himself as greatness. I think he just thought he was a good and decent man. And I think all these families, they didn't become big politicians. They weren't doctors and lawyers. But in my view, and I'm sure in their immediate family's view, they were very special. I think it took a special kind of breed of people to do what they did back then.
Yes. Were any of the ladies women midwives?
You know, I haven't any proof that they were called off to somebody special.
Probably
I
they
think
were.
that they had to take care
Yeah.
of each other. You're working in a very small community, and in the beginning, as they were opening up Sullivan and Holland Township, all you had was your neighbors,
Yeah.
black or white.
That's what I mean.
All you
yeah.
had was your neighbors.
Yeah, so it would
and
be
they were having
interesting if they
lots
were.
of children.
Yeah, so
Usually if you see the birth records after the 1870s especially, you'll start seeing just the names
Yeah.
of the mothers, the sisters,
Yeah.
the neighbors that are there and helping them
Yeah, I
out.
bet you
They
they
would have
were.
had to midwife. It's common
Yeah.
sense, I think, they'd have to midwife. Yeah.
Yeah, and I apologize for saying, did they ever do great things? They all did great things, but I was just wondering if they ever went on to further their education and go on to university or
I
anything
think a lot of them learned how to read and write as the
Yeah.
years went on, and as they were brought into the community where others knew how to read
Yeah.
and write, because they opened schools and what have you
Yeah.
in the area. So.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy, for coming on and talking
Thank
about
you.
this. I could talk forever. And thank you for joining us here on Community Close-Up. Join us again on Rogers TV. Remember to stay safe. COVID's not over, and flu season's coming up. Get your vaccines and wear a mask if you have to. And join us again here on Rogers TV. Bye for now.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
October 5th, 2014, my daughter was hit by a train. She was walking along the sides of the tracks, and it shattered her world.